Okay, this is the first recording that we've done this year, or the second one. Can't remember when the last one was. But anyway, we are here with Mark MacKinnon of Disconomy Publishing doing a Discord open chat recorded Thursday, October 15th, 2020. Everybody is in pandemic overload, so we're trying to do something nice and fun for everybody.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Yeah, I figured this is change things up a little bit. It's been about 6 months since we did the last one, and with BESM finally on shelves and in the hands of just about every backer for the Kickstarter and the crowdfunding campaign, we are good to go. And we have a new Kickstarter coming out on November 10th, which is the next batch of 6 products that we're going to be kickstarting underneath kind of the BESM Extras as the overall kind of name what we're calling the Kickstarter. That's just one of the 6 books. And I thought it would be a good time to pop on, say hi to everyone, and certainly thank you for all your support that you've been showing the company during this time. And again, to offer my sincere apologies for the prolonged time that it took to get the Kickstarter product out. While there was, yes, there was a delay because of COVID, that was not the only problem with this. There were significant problems with the printer itself, and we will not be using that printer again. Now that said, the book looks good. I mean, that everyone is quite happy with how it looks, and I can tell some things that might not have been the way I would have done it, but most people are going to be happy with the physical products. If there were printing errors, then of course we're going to take care of those. There's a few of them that were a little misprinted, or some of them were damaged in shipment. We're taking care of these, but it should have been out months and months and months before that time. But it's done. That's in the past. We've moved forward. We have great new relationship with new printers that we're going to be using going forward from here on. And really happy with how things are going to play out. So in terms of, go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like it was a big learning experience for you.
Yes, it was. I mean, this printer we had never used before, and it was recommended to us. And I thought, okay, well, it seems reasonable, and from a trusted source. And then everything went bad. really quite bad. But in the end, I mean, we can't get together face to face to role play right now. So the fact that it was a little bit more delayed, we got the PDFs out right away. That was more or less on time. The Kickstarter ended. We sent out the advanced playtesting copies within a week or so of the pledge manager being finalized, and so that went out at the right time. We were happy with the digital side, and so everyone had a copy that they can get into and do some stuff with. But in terms of the physical product, took too long. It's done, and we're moving on, and just won't use it.
Well, I for one am a digital only guy, so I honestly didn't know that it was as bad as it was. I'm so sorry that you guys had to go through all of that.
Oh yeah, like it was beyond bad, and the communication was just terrible in terms of, like, I'd send off a message that, okay, here's the instructions that I want, and then months would go by, and then I'd find out they weren't followed. And so pretty frustrating stuff, and that's always a possibility. And it's one of those reasons on Kickstarter as well, they have that little section about the risks in the bottom, and you always type in, it's like, well, there could be delays at the printer or the shipping or customs or something like that. And customs didn't take long. We flew through customs right once it actually landed. But this is precisely the reason why there are those risks for Kickstarter. That doesn't always turn out the way we want. So to have a late Kickstarter, it's not something I'm proud of. I'm proud of the work and what it turned out in the end, and I'm proud that people got their digital copies really quickly. But I feel that people put trust in what we're doing and what I was saying, and then finding out it wasn't exactly the way I was saying it was going to be. It also was a little bit more problematic with Japanime Games in the mix as well, where I wasn't in full control of the Kickstarter and the information flow with the printer. Not that is anyone's fault. It's just a process that had multiple people involved in a way that I wasn't used to. I'm used to dealing with that directly. So going forward, we're going to do things a little differently. So the November 10th Kickstarter for BESM Extras, so Disconomy is hosting that directly. It's not going to be Japanime Games hosting it. They are doing their own Kickstarter coming up very shortly for one of their card games, and it's going to end only a couple days before the BESM Extras Kickstarter needs to launch, and so it just made sense for Discovery to take it over. They're still handling all of our sales and distribution and everything else. The relationship is the same. It's just the Kickstarter is now going to be under our control, and so we're going to be able to respond a lot more quickly and agilely for something like that, as well as the printing is underneath fully my control as well, and so that's going to be much better situation. So when I'm looking at how to proceed forward with this, tonight is not about me. It's not about Discovery. It's about kind of you guys, everyone turning in, and what do we want to see and what do we want to talk about. I could certainly fill up hours of just discussing stuff. I can talk about plans. I could talk about what's going on. I can talk about the history. But now that kind of things are out there may be different questions that come up. And so I guess probably the best way to do this is there's an awful lot of channels I'm not going to be able to follow, but this text forum channel underneath the live, I guess if people had comments or questions, that would be a good place to put it in there. Mm-hmm. Was that kind of the intent? Is that's the communicate with me form? Okay, that's what I thought. So
yeah.
If I need to type anything or post anything, then I can do it in that one as well. And then I'll just, of course, talk in the voice.
So I think the first question we have from William was submitted early.
Oh, yes.
Kind of goes along with the table of contents that was posted earlier today, our little teaser. Right. Thank you very much for that.
No one's seen that. Like that. This is the first time that was ever released. So it's a little bit of a sneak preview for everyone that's supporting us here on the Discord. So
yeah. So thank you very much for sharing early. It's always nice to have sneak peeks and whatnot. But so the question asked by William is, will BESM Extras include list of individual skills as in DX or 3rd edition?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that is the entirety of chapter 2. Yeah, the entire chapter for that. And so whenever early on, at the very beginning, BESM did not have any skills. And then when 2nd edition came out, when we did kind of transitioning over from, say, Hot Rods and Gun Bunnies, which was a 1st edition book, and then we did the 2nd edition, it certainly made sense at that point for us to do individual skills. And as that eventually morphed into Silverblade Sentinels and Tristat DX, then we realized you can't just have a skill list that is independent of genre, because it doesn't make any sense. Like, how do you price what driving a car is? Well, if you're in a place where everyone has a car, it's a very different skill than if you're driving it like only 3 people in the planet have a car. Well, if you have skills in that car, that's a very different usage of the skill. And so that's where the idea of the varying the skill cost by genre, coming out with that aspect, it made me realize that when I'm doing 4th edition, although a lot of people like the detailed skill list, which, because they're allowing you to a lot more granularity, it didn't make sense to do that as the baseline for BESM 4th edition, which was designed to be streamlined and quick, easy to grasp. So it in my head, I always knew, well, we're going to do skill groups, and that is just larger categories of skills. So someone doesn't need to be quite as specific. If you want to be a scientist, you don't have to get all the science skills. You can just take someone that has science skills overall. But the knowing that extras was part of the package, while I was writing BESM 4th edition, I knew BESM Extras would be the next book in the line. So putting an entire chapter of that, which is going to look similar to some of the books in the past, like DX, for example, or something in 3rd edition, where it does go through every skill. And there's a few extra skills that were added in. People that might have been following Guardians of Order and me for a while, and David Pulver's comments, who did most of the development work on 2nd edition. I do not like social skills. In general, I find that you role play. Like, how many times have people been playing D&D and someone will say, okay, I want to roll my bluff skill. I'm going to bluff them about X. And then they just roll a die, and then it's, okay, you were successful in bluffing them. But there's no role playing in there. And I never liked that. I always thought, well, you're not going to role play out your chemistry skill, because that would be boring. I could do it. I have 8 years of experience in chemistry. However, most people are not going to want to role play through chemistry. Yeah, because that's where my training was.
I've watched 8 years of Stargate. Does that count?
Yeah, well, close. But certainly going with something like bluffing, persuasion. I wanted people to role play these things out. And so I was very hesitant to put a lot of the social skills.
My thoughts in the past decade have come around a little bit. And while I still think role playing is the most important part,
at the same time, I think that you can still use skills as your baseline. of it. So you do your role playing, you interact with your GM or the other players the best you can, and then you rely on the die roll if you need to do a skill roll from there. And so that's why we do have an entire chapter dedicated to the different skills, some new skills in there, mainly social skills are the new ones. We've recategorized a couple of them, expanded a couple of them. But for people that want that level of detail, we have it's almost like the old sub-attribute system that for 1, 2, or you spend a certain number of points of your character points and you get 10 skill points, for example. And those skill points are then spent on the other ones. So the goal was that when we have, say, the skill groups were priced at 1, 2, or 3 points per rank, that if you had, say, advanced skills and you took level 3, so you have a +3 in all adventuring skills. In the new skill system, that would give you, for the same number of character points, a certain number of skill points that if you acquired the same types of highly impactful skills, so not like cooking, if that's more of a domestic skill and usually doesn't have a lot of cost associated with it. But if you're taking your high impact adventuring skills, then theoretically you would have very close to the same alignment, whether you took individual skills or you took skill groups for the same number of character points. You should get roughly the same amount of competency. It can't be exact because it's obviously going to be specific details, but that was the goal of that. So that's a very, very long answer. I could have just said yes, but that actually kind of gives you a little bit of a peeking behind the curtain in terms of what we're doing with the skill list in going forward, new edition in extras. All right, next.
All right, sorry, we're having a little bit of a technical IT help with one of the people who
I see
that. Someone who's new to Discord, which honestly they don't make it super terribly easy. So I'm gonna see if we can get him. I'm assuming him, William.
Yeah, William. And he was the one that submitted the question, and now he missed it. So let's delete that part of the audio so he'll never know the answer.
Indeed, we will. So I guess to kind of piggyback off of the tangent that you went on about not liking social skills and social combat, looks like 2 pages of social combat in extras, pages 54 and 55.
Yes, exactly. And so you'd think, well, why would you put a social combat system in if you don't like doing social stuff? Well, the interesting, like while I do, I'm more of a theater of the mind role, kind of a tactical miniatures. When you're doing your D&D dungeon crawl, you want to push around your miniatures. You enjoy doing that. But for something like BESM, I much prefer role playing it out with your text, of course, by speaking on what's going on. But with social combat, there's these situations where when you read either a really good work of fiction or maybe watch a really interesting anime show, where you have these interactions between characters where they're designed to kind of one up the other person in a social style setting. So, you think of a typical example where you have 2 people meeting up at a grand ballroom and they're enemies, whether it's you got your classic, Lex Luthor and Clark Kent or Superman, or you have, a group of characters, maybe one kind of big villain that has several henchmen with them, and against the one person, you got your James Bond scenario. I mean, it's so common to have these social situations where they start sparring verbally about stuff. And the goal, of course, is to, in some ways, sway the public in terms of what's going on. So social combat is not about shedding them and they're losing hit points. It's about can you get the upper hand in them so that you look great and they look foolish? Or can you one-up them in a war of words to publicly humiliate them? And there was really no system for that for BESM. In the past, I would just do that through role-playing, and you'd spar with the game master, typically if they're running the NPCs, and you'd spar back and forth with them. And that is still encouraged. But having a social combat system that goes along with that as well, I thought was an interesting take, because we've never done anything like that in BESM. And the system that I used when I created the social combat, because this is a very new mechanic, it hasn't appeared in any of our books in the past. This actually, I realize, applies to several different other aspects you can use, including we have the mass combat as well, army versus army. And the BESM system is so streamlined and simple. There was a way, particularly with the advantages through obstacles and edges, to comparing different categories. So, for example, with the social combat in the social battlefield, when two people are going to socially spar off against each other, things are going to make a difference, like who has more societal privilege. So if you are, say, playing in a tavern setting in a traditional fantasy world, and one race, with the dwarves, for example, or the halflings, are underprivileged, well, they're not going to be able to sway the crowds in the same way as someone like maybe a high elf, for example. And so if you have more societal privilege, you will have an advantage in social. If you are physically more intimidating, even though it's a social combat thing, how you stand and your posture and the overall, size of it, that plays into it. Going for wealth, as part of privilege, certainly who has more money, who has higher connected attributes. All of these factors are going to play in, and you're going to kind of go up and down do you have no advantage, in which case it's roughly equal. So if two people are both ultra rich, and they're having a sparring match, well, in that case, no one has an advantage in that particular category. But someone may have a significant advantage or an overwhelming advantage in that. And because of that, they are going to be gaining major or minor edges. And then you go through all the different categories, which are usually around 10 different categories, either in social combat or mass combat, of where these different categories would apply. And you say, well, this character A would have a major advantage in this category. Character B would have a minor advantage in this category. And then you would go through, and there's a way to cancel out. So obviously, if I have a major advantage and you have a major advantage, well, they would cancel each other out, of course. And so you would just go through, and in the end, you'd end up having one character will have a role that'll probably be either an advantage or either sort of like a major obstacle edge or a minor edge. And then you roll the die. And you apply that particular thing that you're doing with the attack, social combat role that you're doing, and you get the advantage to your role, or disadvantage if you're playing against the GM. Usually, it's you're going to have an combat with, and so you're resolving an entire role-playing scenario around a social setting to see who can one-up the other character with a single roll, based on many aspects of the character, about their privilege level, their wealth level, their connected level. If they're, for example, in mass combat, if one army has a terrain advantage because they're familiar with the terrain, that would give them an advantage in mass combat. So we have one system that applies to both mass or social combat that is very, very much a feel of it. It doesn't feel like it's a completely new mechanic. It just takes some of the elements that we've already had, integrates it really well, I think, and I'm really happy with how that work played out. In the end, some people may decide not to ever use a combat role for social combat, and they'll just role play it out. And that is totally fine. That's how I've done it for pretty well most of my role-playing life. But here is a simple, optional way of expanding the game mechanics if people want to do it. So yeah, I'm really happy with how those bigger combat systems turned.
Well, I, for one, am one of those crazy people who actually enjoys having my character skill dictate how well they talk, because obviously I stumble over my own words. So thank you for including that for people like me.
Well, I mean, and you do hit on something that's certainly we address somewhat in BESM itself, is the idea of character competency versus player competency. So if you're trying to play someone who has a mind of 11, well, I don't know how to be a mind of 11. I'm not that smart. I'm not that expansive. And so you do have to, the rules give you more than what your physical limitations are. And so, yeah, so that is something that's important. At the same time, I've also seen situations, probably most of it, many of us have, where someone plays a character, say they are terrible at combat, or they are terrible in a particular situation, but the player happens to have competency in that area, and they'll often talk far above what their character would normally be able to do. And they can often convince the GM sometimes of their competency. I mean, I've been in Amber is my favorite role-playing game. So Amber, being diceless, doesn't even have the rolls to back up on. But frequently, how good a particular player can talk to a game master may influence what their character can do, which is why I think it's important to have this overlaying system that does give you that ability to say, well, my character is more than I am, or less than I am in certain situations. So hopefully this will be a selection of rules. In this entire book was always set out not to say everything in the core book you're not doing it well enough. Here's a bunch of new stuff, and this is what you should be using. It was more, here's a bunch of options that you may want to have. And the core book is my vision of BESM in 4th edition. That is what I think, if you never picked up extras, great. I think I could run a most amazing campaign with just the core book forever. But for people that want those extra things like the called shots or critical hits, or social combat, mass combat, whatever. If you want those little extra things, here's a way to just make it a little bit easier. And so that was the goal. And then hopefully there'll be something that everyone will find useful for their own game. Not everything is going to be useful for everyone's game, but if everyone can take something, it's like, oh, I really like this, or I really like that, which is one of the reasons I wanted to release the tales of contents early before this, is just to give people a bit of an understanding of, yeah, there's going to be something in here for me.
Alrighty, so we have 2 questions from the live audience, both from Josh. First one is, are, quote, base stats purchases as opposed to the augmented attribute effectively an attribute under the hood? I'm asking from the viewpoint of a person trying to write a character generator tool.
Oh, yeah. That was some of the discussion that happened earlier. And I saw the comment. Someone said, well, let's just ask Mark whenever the discussion happened, which is great. So, no, they are effectively not the same. So a stat, if it's purchased as a stat and not through augmented, but it's a stat, that's a baseline capability. It's not an attribute in any way. Attributes are usually things that are added onto someone that can at some point be perhaps nullified or taken away from the character in some form. So you can say, well, I mean, I fly and I have wings, or I'm a bird. How can you possibly take away flight if I'm a bird? It's like, well, okay, you're right. There are certain attributes, if you define it in certain ways, that you really can't take it away. However, that's going to be the minority. A lot of the
penguins would beg to differ with you, of course.
Well, that's true. But with stats, this is your baseline. This is who you are, not what you can do in many ways. And so you can build it because it's character points, and in the end, it's 2 points per rank if you don't use any kind of variation on the point. And so it's from a character generator tool. It's going to be very simple. It costs you 2 points, and you can put 2 points to increase your body by 1, or you can put 2 points to increase an attribute by 1 or 2 levels, depending on the cost per level. So you can treat them as attributes because they're purchased with points, but I would say they are very different in terms of the core fundamental aspect of what an attribute is, which is why the augmented attribute was put in to say, well, my base mind is, say, a 4, but I have had technological augmentation. I have a chip in my head that brings my mind from a 4 to an 8. But if an EMP pulse went off, that extra aspect of that 4 to 8 through the augmented, that might be turned off, but my baseline is still there because that's who I am. I hope that kind of answers your question of how I viewed it.
Well, and as a web developer myself, on the back end, I think what he's trying to get at is your stats are a separate item, your attributes are a separate item. From a character generator, you would just take the value of the stat plus the value of augment, take your body plus augment body minus, what's that defect that reduces inept? Shortcoming, yeah, and then minus shortcoming, and that's what you would display on your character generator tool. You'd just be grabbing info from different places.
Right, and that's if you look at Germanic Persona and how any of the volumes and how they're statted out, you have your section, your stats, and then you have a section of your attributes and your section of your defects, and it's literally A plus B minus C.
And then Josh's second question, which I think is actually a very interesting question that never came to my mind, but he asked when you were talking about the new skills as opposed to skill groups, can they be mixed? Can I have an overall skill group science and then a skill in biology?
You certainly could. There's no reason. It's just points, right? So you can mix anything if it's just a point base, but they aren't really intended to function together. Skill groups is the simplicity, the fast way of doing things, those are skill groups. The individual skills is a more detailed and involved way of doing things. But I see what you're saying. It's almost like a specialization. So I have level 3 in sciences, but my biology is another 2 levels on top of that. And so you could do that. We used to have in previous editions of BESM, there was a skill specialization that you bought a skill, and then every skill had a specialization. And that was part of it, just from my own background, being, having a science background, that I knew chemistry better than physics, but I still had a baseline of sciences. And so the original system for skills that came out is you would take your physical sciences skill, and that might be level 3, and then you took a free specialization, say chemistry. And you can add in additional specializations for additional points, but you always got one free specialization. You could combine the two to kind of give that similar effect. There's no reason you couldn't, other than the fact that it's a little more awkward and just combining the two. But really, it's certainly no more complex than dynamic powers or power flux. So if you're comfortable with the idea of a little bit of bookkeeping, combine the two. If that suits your game, go right ahead. It might not be something I would do. It might not be something a different person would do. Someone else may like the individual skills. Someone may like the skill groups. And if you want to combine them, go right ahead and do that. That's one of the, I guess, the core flexibility that I always wanted with BESM is just take what works for you and your group and change what doesn't or ignore what doesn't. And every group can have a different experience. Now, that does frustrate people when they want that consistency. I mean, if I was to try to do an RPGA version, if people still remember the RPGA, or like an organized play type system where I'm trying to get 30,000 people playing the same thing, well, you don't want flexibility in that. You want it to be standardized. Well, I'm not planning for that. So standardization, not important for BESM. What is important is the flexibility. So every game group can do.
Yeah, and I think one of the big takeaways is, as long as it's internally consistent, as long as everybody at your table is using the same default assumption and same baseline, then that's what matters. It doesn't matter that I'm doing it differently than Mark, than Josh, than Gray Pix, who just posted a question, so I'm looking right at the name. It doesn't matter that we treat things differently. At my table, all of my players and all of my NPCs use the same baseline assumption for all the rules, and that's the important part.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that works. I mean, do what's good for your group, and as long as everyone in the group is on the same page, and that a lot of it comes from session 0. I mean, it's interesting.
Yes, your video the other day.
Yeah, it's talking about getting together and having everyone on the same page, which is it's not saying the GM will then tell you everything you need to know about the game. It's discuss the game, because my thinking is, in the best scenario, the GM does not say, here's the setting that we're doing, here's the characters you're going to play, here's the parameters we're going to do for comedy versus drama, and here's all the rules. No, it's sitting down and saying, hey, let's talk about all these things. What do people want to see? Do we want to use critical hit rules? Let's talk about that. And maybe enough people do, we'll use them. Or maybe you don't want to do that. But I think that while the game master is running the game, they're not the one setting up all the parameters about the game. That is what the group does collectively. And so something like that, as long as everyone's on the same page, it works.
And speaking of Gray Pix, they have a question. The mimic attribute allows you to temporarily use someone else's attributes after a touch. But if the attribute has a duration of 1 month, what should I do in this case? It will be considered one attribute for a touch, or a single attribute for the single mimic attribute.
Whoa, okay, so I could actually see that text, so let me just quickly review that to absorb what it's saying.
So we actually did discuss this a little bit earlier,
right.
If I have mimic once, can I touch 4 different people and mimic 4 different attributes, or do I need to take mimic 4 times in order to have 4 consecutive mimics going?
Right, and in some ways that's going to be somewhat of an individual group, but mimic itself, it's very clear in what it does, where you can mimic someone's ability and for a certain period of time. And so if you're mimicking someone's ability that is longer than that period, like, for example, we mentioned the duration of a month. Well, if I'm it might be a month. Like, you may have an ability of, just say, flight, makes it simple. So you turn it on, for some reason you can fly for a month. Hopefully you can land at some point, but so you can fly for a month, and then I mimic your ability. Well, I don't mimic it and get it for a month because you've had it for a month. What I do is I'll get all the parameters of it, but I only get it for the period of time that mimic indicates, which is the 1 minute or dramatic scene. And that's somewhat for a balance reason, of course. What you don't want is people just mimicking everyone's abilities, because not everything has a duration either. Some things are permanent. Like, if I have a combat mastery that doesn't have a duration and I mimic that, well, like do I mimic like 5 people's combat mastery, each at level 3, and so I'm like plus 15 combat mastery? Maybe in some campaign, that may be a reasonable interpretation of how that works, depending on what your power function is. I think that kind of goes a little beyond what would be reasonable for a game. And you consider, because again, power gamers will always do what power gamers want to do. Same with munchkins. And it's up to the game master to reel things in as needed. But if you give players a chance to min-max the system, they will do so. So consider a situation where you're in a group of five players. 4 of them take combat mastery in level 3, and 1 person takes mimic. So at the beginning of every combat, they just walk around and they mimic their 4 partners. They each got level 3 combat mastery. Suddenly they're at a plus 12 for combat mastery, and they are the tank that leads every combat. Like, is that what you want in your game? And maybe it is. I mean, kind of, you could say, well, it doesn't break the rules because we have a maximum benchmark of 3, and that person only has a level 3 mimic. Well, yeah, okay. And so are they additive? I would say no. That seems to be a little weird. If you can justify it in some way, then sure. But in general, I would say mimicking one ability at a time is probably a decent rule balancing thing, especially when you're looking at things that are part of your companions. So it's very different if you're in combat and say I'm the character that has mimic and I'm running up and I'm fighting the bad guys in the event, and I touch one of them and I get one of his abilities and I'm fighting him, and then in 30 seconds later a different villain runs up and I touch him and I get his ability, and so now I have 2 abilities, and you could think, okay, that's actually kind of neat, as opposed to at the beginning of every combat I run around and I mimic every ability of every one of my allies. Well, if you don't have any restrictions, you could theoretically do that. And you have a minute, and how long does it take to do a mimic action? Is it 3 seconds? So boom, 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 I mimic all of your abilities. And then all of your friends' abilities and all of another friend's abilities. And now I only have 10 seconds left in combat. I only have a couple rounds, but by that time you are practically a god, because you now with 300-point characters, if you've mimicked so many abilities. That's kind of goes beyond to what it was intended. Yeah. If it works for your game, go ahead and do it. But no, it is considered a single attribute, one at a time, for a minute, for dramatic effect. That was the intention, but players and GMs can be creative.
Alrighty. Saber Expert, in the same train of thought as mimic lasting 1 minute per dramatic scene. For the imbue limiter, is there a duration for imbue, or is it permanent?
Right. So I'm sure Saber would be happy if I just said, ask your GM.
Well, actually, it says the character does not use the attribute themselves directly, but instead grants its use to others for the duration of 1 dramatic scene. Imbue has a built-in limit. Look at that. I can read. Yes.
So it's built in there. And the intent for imbue was simply that, we can all think of examples in some sort of fiction. Someone has ability, but they're not using it themselves. So if you have, as an example, you are an inspiring person in some form that, say, take a religious aspect, that you religiously encourage something in someone. It doesn't have to be an inspire attribute, but because of your faith, people around you get a benefit. Like, you don't get the benefit, people around you do. That was the intention for it. And it's interesting, I didn't put it in the printed version of the rule, and I did have to, a slight errata that I just expanded a little bit in the PDF, was that, no, obviously the imbue is not imbued. As well. You don't get this, like, I give you an ability and you give it to someone and you give it to someone. No, it doesn't work with that. Like, that's kind of the one thing you take out. But because of the way customization works with attributes, with the limiters and enhancements, even though you're not giving someone the imbue, it doesn't change the effective level of it. So you just kind of ignore the fact that imbue is part of it. And I did kind of mention that. Yeah, it's just like it was a really minor aspect, and to me it was so obvious that imbue is not taken, but just to be a little bit more clear on that. So if it's clear that it's kind of a duration of 1 dramatic scene, then I think that's what imbue. And yeah, I could see your comment about, hey, didn't read the manual. Well, it's a big manual. It's a big book, and I certainly don't have everything in there memorized. So it was a great question. But yeah,
my book's only 146 pages, so
Oh, there you go. You get a much shorter one than other people's. There is an advantage with the naked.
Yep, I am a huge fan of the naked version, mostly because I am poor and can't afford the full book. But this was actually discussed earlier today, I think, or maybe it was yesterday. Someone was asking about the differences, and Cookie was like, there's so much good stuff in the full version. I'm like, I have no idea what I'm missing.
Right.
I hear there's all this good stuff, but I don't have a copy of that, so I don't know what I don't have. So I just it works for me.
And when you compare, I mean, in many ways, Naked was kind of the idea, almost the third edition. If you pick up the first edition, 96-page, small little book, versus now fourth edition, like 350 pages, by far the biggest version of BESM, and yet there's tons of stuff that isn't in this book that is putting in next. I mean, it's huge, and I like the simple. I wanted something that was a throwback back to the simple rules, and how much descriptive text do you need to be when you could literally just say jumping, you can jump far. I mean, and then you say you can jump 3 times as far, 10 times as far. I mean, how much text do you need around that? Well, to have it a more comprehensive thing, you want to maybe reference what the average person can jump this far based on their body stat, and jumping allows you to blah blah blah. Maybe these are the types of characters that can use jumping. So there's value in having something bigger. But if you're an experienced role player, sometimes just like make it small, make it inexpensive, and make it compact. And so when we did Naked, that was, again, to be more like first/1.5 edition. But the actual inspiration of that came from when I wanted to do it was third edition BESM. We had planned to do what's called vanilla BESM, which was the exact same thing as Naked, but vanilla. And what we did is, unlike if everyone does the third edition, well, we're going to have a kind of a creamy color for the book instead of red, and that was vanilla BESM. Vanilla being the play on the color, as well as vanilla being plain. So when I didn't want to repeat that idea, because hey, that was an idea that never came to fruition because I sold off the rights to that. But whenever I saw what I was going to do for BESM fourth edition, I thought, well, Naked is kind of interesting, and I had an idea from the main characters that I wanted the 3 characters on the cover. And then when I talked to Nico Geyer, I said, can you just do 2 versions of every character? Like, it's almost like put clothes on them and then have a layer in Photoshop where I can take the clothes off them. And thus I have the exact same characters in their underwear or with their clothes on. And we'll do Naked. And again, Naked has that double entendre meaning of stripped down, naked, as well as, look, the characters have no clothes on. That's kind of funny. And so it was just a different version of doing the BESM vanilla. But the reason why I did that is because in my heart, I am a rules-light gamer. And it's interesting. Look at, like, Mark, how can you be a rules-light gamer? You wrote a 352-page gigantic tome on BESM, and then you wrote extras on top of there. But that's not my style of play for everything, but I know that gamers like these things. And so I'll have the full description and have the full. But if you have a chance to look at the first edition PDF, if you don't actually own the book, and look through there, you'll see that everything was so simple back then. Like magic was level 1 magic, you can do minor magic. Level 2 magic, you can do more powerful magic. I mean, that was the entirety of the magic system, was just, really good, better, best type of thing. And I know that we need, today's gaming, maybe we need a little bit more explanation than that. But at its core, that's all really BESM is. Level 1 is not as good as level 2. It's not as good as level 3. The details of that are not important. What's important is, hey, I have level 3 flight. Oh, I have level 4 flight. Well, I guess you're better than I am then. And then you just fill in the details of through role play.
Yeah, and in the interim between third and fourth edition, when OVA kind of tried to fill in the niche that BESM left, there was a lot of discussion on the forums about, well, how does this work? If they have a level 3 and I only have a level 2, well, obviously it's better, but how much? It's like, well, you're just adding more dice, so obviously you have a better chance of rolling. Just forget about it, move on. The story's more important.
Yeah, and for some people, the story isn't more important. And I didn't want those gamers left out, just because it's not my style of gaming. I am committed to creating a commercial product, and I want the most number of players to be happy. And so I could easily just hand wave everything, because I think, hey, that's the right way to role play, in my opinion. But if that's not how you want to role play, I still want to give you some tools. It might not be all the tools you want. I'm not producing the amount of volume of work that's in 3 volumes of Dungeons and Dragons, for example. Like it's not as big as that, but it is designed to be closer to that than it is just what I want to do. I'm producing a book for other people, even if I'm writing it from my point. Saber, you're exactly the type of person that, I've seen your posts and you like the rules. That's great. I think you'll love BESM extras. I think you'll enjoy most of the material in there. Most of the stuff I would not use in my own personal game. If someone wants to describe how to do I want to do a called shot, and I'll just bring it up on the fly. And, if it hits, hey, yeah, their head explodes because you hit them with a gun in the head, and cool. But now we have rules for it. I know that people like them. So I'm hoping that extras is going to be what everyone is looking for, at least something in there. And in the end, if they still want more, like give me precise, exacting rules on Magic. Well, maybe BESM is not the system that can do that as easily. It's not. Dungeons and Dragons almost has like almost 100 pages of spells. It's just an incredible amount of just like so specific. Really, the difference between a lightning bolt, a magic missile, and a fireball. The fact that they have huge amounts of text for all of them, they're just aggressive attacks. Like you could just make it up, right?
And I'll make it up myself.
But there's a reason why they have millions of people playing D&D, and I do not have a million people playing BESM. So they're probably more commercially right than I am. But hopefully, at least we can give something of what people are looking.
All right, so Saber Expert was asking, are there any new enhancements or limiters in extras? Like a progression chart or something for time limit as opposed to duration enhancement?
Right, and so there are a few things. We don't have a lot, as you can see. It's quite small. Some of the individual attributes will have some enhancements limiters. Like for example, you can have an airtight force as a limiter for a force field. It would be impacting force field, but that's when if you're using knockback, it would be a limiter for the force field. But in terms of just like the naked enhancements, and there's no new enhancements, but we do ratchet up. I do provide level 7 assignments up to 11 plus assignments. So if you really wanted to have like, well, I'm playing a game and I want to hit the moon from the earth with a particular spell or weapon, well, okay, that's 10 assignments of now. And so I just extrapolate those out. But there is a new limiter, which is called acceleration. And that has stuff like, for example, the illusion and meta, like they last typically for 1 minute dramatic scene as it's outlined there. Well, acceleration allows us to make it shorter, because the effective time that you're going to have, it can be shorter as a limiter, but you can also use it as an enhancement. Like it's weird, like acceleration, you can use it both ways. Think of something like power flux. So you cannot change once you use your power flux. There is an amount of time between when you can switch it and use it a different attribute. Usually it's 1 every minute, for example. So with power flux, I assign my attributes and with the things that it does, and then a minute later I can change it, and a minute later I can change it again. Well, if you want to make it faster and change it out every 30 seconds or every 5 rounds or every round even, you can end up getting a limiter, which is now actually as an enhancement. In addition, there's also 2 new called Haywire and Ignore. And Haywire is something that causes certain conditions where your attribute doesn't function properly. So, for example, it could be like, near meteor rocks, my powers don't work this certain way. That would be Haywire. Where something like Ignore would be that your attributes do not kind of register something. So it could be, my spells do not work against wood. So I have a wood weakness of some sort, or a lead weakness. And so if I'm trying to do something and I'm trying to attack your sword and it's metal, no problem, I can affect it. But if you have a wooden sword, my ability does not work against you. And so that there, you got the Smallville reference. So that there would be how Ignore would work. And so there's only 3 new limiters. And then, of course, the acceleration, which can also be. There isn't a lot, because the core book was kind of everything that I wanted. And then you have your, obviously, your very specific ones for your different attributes. Those could be expanded.
Alrighty. So next question from not live audience is, BESM uses D6s, and I believe Absolute Power is going to as well. I heard that Tristat was built to handle bigger dice too. Are there any plans for games or expansions which may use bigger dice? And this was asked by Retro Tom.
Yeah, and that's a great question. It certainly makes sense based on the history. But we actually do explain in BESM Extras with a sidebar that the different sizes dice, they'll never need to be anything other than D6s in
any tri-stat game now. And the reason why is because it's now roll over versus under. So when you consider, when I had Silver Age Sentinels, a superhero game, you're playing levels of Goku or Superman, like really, really super powerful people. And let's just say you had a body stat of, let's say 18 for something, versus in an anime game, you're playing maybe something a little bit normal, maybe a body stat of 6 or 7 or 8. Well, if I'm using 2d6, then rolling under an 18 on 2d6, well, I can never fail. So you can't have, when you're ratcheting up the power scale with a roll under, you can't use dice that can't even ever reach the level that you're at. If 12 is the highest you can roll, if you have a body of 18, it means you can never fail unless something was outrageously difficult and you start bringing it. And so it certainly made sense that when we went to Silver Age Sentinel, went to the D10, went to Authority, which is like a really powerful superhero, went to D12s. So now we kind of shifted almost the entire bell curve. And so now what was considered normal difficulty for a game with a bunch of people that are superheroes is not going to be a normal difficulty for a bunch of people that are high school students in an anime game. And so by using the different size dice, what was normal changed, that definition changed as well. Well, that's roll under. When we switched to a roll over system in 3rd edition, and really got into expanding it in 4th edition, now because it's roll over, your 18 body stat or your 6 body stat, those two characters in a contest of wills using body, like say an arm wrestle, because it's now roll over, you can both use the same dice and it's on the same power scale. Now, obviously, if I have an 18, I'm rolling 2d6, and you have a 6 and you're rolling 2d6, what is the chance of me losing? I mean, it's probably not going to happen because mathematically it's, unless there's some edges or obstacles or modifiers in there. But let's say something that's a little bit more reasonable. You got a 14 versus a 7. Well, on a 2d6, the person that has a 7 could roll a 12, and the person that have a 14 could roll a 2. And so the 7 could end up beating, using the 2d6s for both of them, could end up beating someone with the 14. And so when we looked at doing the rollover system, it doesn't matter what power level you are. You can have your 24 body. You can have a 100 body, whatever number you want it to have. All you're doing is you're rolling 2d6 and adding them. And so the additive system allowed us to just have one set of dice, which just made sense. And so, it's a great question. But the dice, the reason why we use the different size dice, not because it was kind of cool, is because mathematically we had to in that roll under system. That was probably the biggest motivation to switch from a roll under to a roll over, was actually the dice size. While it was really neat, Tri-Stat DX as a concept, there wasn't another game out there that kind of did what we did with it. But writing it, I'm like, this is really neat, working with the system we have, but damn, this is inelegant. This is like, I'm kind of shoehorning the rules and it works, but there has to be a better way. And rolling over gives that advantage. The other big reason was the idea of the modifiers. So when you're rolling under, if something is a good thing, you get a negative modifier, which sounds a little weird because we wanted to modify the roll, not modify your body. So your body is not being modified, in which case you'd say in a roll under system, well, you have an advantage. So you'd modify your body up from your 7 up to an 11, and therefore rolling under it is easier. But I never liked the idea of saying you're modifying your body, because you weren't. All you're doing is you're modifying the difficulty. And so that's a die roll. The die roll determines the difficulty, in which case, you have a positive benefit here, so let's give you a negative modifier. And just not intuitive for most people. And so those are the two reasons we ended up switching to a rollover system. So now it's 2d6 all day long. Someone could use a different size die. It's just mathematically it's going to mess everything up. You could do it. You could easily do it, but it does change kind of how things function. All the baseline, what the modifiers were, it does change that. So if you're not too concerned about the game balance, use your D30 dice if you want to. Like whatever dice you want. I mean, it doesn't make too much a difference. It's just going to be a little bit more work if you decide to go anything other than D6s.
And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is as long as the entire table is using the same dice, like you said, it's roll over. So just, modify the target numbers appropriately and you're fine.
Yeah. I mean, and going along with the idea of the rollover, and as long as everybody's on the same page, that's one of the foundational aspects of Chapter 9, which is diceless BESM. Why roll dice? Why bring in that 2d6 variation? Just give everyone a 7. on every roll, and now it's diceless. And so it just removes the randomness that over enough rolls it was going to be averaged out to be a 7 anyway. So it's kind of like the D&D third edition was the old like take 10. And we did take 6 in third edition of BESM, and now it's 7, just be easier to work with. And so, yeah, you're doing diceless, just give everyone a 7 for every roll that they make. And suddenly it's super streamlined. If you wanted to make that a 10 or a 12 or 3 or whatever, as long as everyone is working on the exact same number, then it doesn't make a difference.
All right. Next question is from Akai Neko, which for those of you who don't speak Japanese, I think is Red Cat. Is there going to be more mecha/item related rules in extras?
So we don't need rules. So people often will talk about, because in earlier editions of that, we had like specific mecha rules, specific item rules. But what is an item versus a person? Like they're the exact same thing. They have the same functionality. And so everything that's in the base game or in extras applies equally across the board. You would create a robot mecha, or you would create a car, or you'd create a magical ring the same way you create a character. Now, you may not end up having stats, but that's what the item attribute is for. The item attribute just said, well, because it's external to you, create it as if, like with all the same attributes and all the same defects, enhancements, limiters, create it the exact same way, and then you get it at 50% because it's external. That rule still holds. So in terms of new rules like that, no, we give some, there's a little bit more about vehicle customization and weapon customization, which is a throwback way back to Hot Rods and Gun Bunnies, which is more flavor. It's not a new rule. It's more context. So anyone could have a feature for rifle scopes or fast loading or brass catchers or souped up engines or whatnot. So that was always easy to do, and you could have just hand-waved that with yours. Well, we go into a little bit more details and accessory holes and weapons. And while it's specific to cars and kind of handguns, you could easily extrapolate that out to giant robots and crossbows, for example. Extrapolate tech. But one of the things we do give, and this is in chapter 8, which you can see is the items and weapons. So we give over 20 pages of write-ups of a bunch of different weapons, from binding contracts. So, here's a contract 2 people sign. Well, here's what a contract does. We have keys to summon. If anyone's a fairy tale, they watch the fairy tale show, summoning keys. So you have keys that can summon different monsters. For example, we have them. So we give a lot of different examples now with write-ups about what they can do, and it's not all intended to be used like, okay, well, unlike the monster manual in D&D where you be like hundreds of monsters, you're not giving hundreds of items. Well, these weren't intended to be exhaustive, but they were to kind of show you what you can, as well as actually give you things you can use right off the bat. But it also just shows you, this is how you can use these items in kind of different ways. So that's what we do in BESM Extras, but it is not a comprehensive book of items and equipment and vehicles. And we don't have a huge number of rules. Like what about mecha combat rules? Well, mecha combat is no different than character combat. We have the built-in rules for that in the base system. And so we don't overemphasize what an item is or what a mecha is versus characters, because they are fundamentally the same thing. When you're looking at a role-playing game, you don't need a special set of rules because we're not a tactical game. And because we're not tactical, we don't have to have different rules. If a mecha can fly and a character can fly, they're going to have the same rule.
Alrighty. And speaking of flight, we do have a question in the chat from Blue Tressum, I think is how it's pronounced. I'm hoping. Are attribute levels supposed to be added to dice rolls for that attribute? So if I have 2 ranks in flight, if I have to roll body to make a landing in bad weather, is it 2d6 plus body or 2d6 plus body plus flight?
Right. So typically with those, most of the attributes you add in, like Mind Shield, for example, it'll tell you to do. Most of the time, the attributes indicate what you can do. And if a roll is needed, you usually do not add in your attribute level unless the GM feel that would be appropriate to do. But no, normally attribute levels are not added to rolls. The ones that it makes sense to do so, they're specifically mentioned. Some of them may be actual role attributes, and some of them you might be adding edges, for example. But typically, no, you would not norm that. If you're actually looking at most of the attributes in BESM, the majority by far don't have any roles involved, and that was a purposeful decision. So if your character can fly, you probably don't need to about flying. If your character has combat mastery, you probably don't need to roll for that. Even something that you'd think teleport. It's like, well, do you really want to roll to see if you can teleport? Like, if you can do it, can't you just do it? There are a few things, like when you're involving with other people, like mind control, for example. Well, something that's inherently oppositional, you're probably going to want to bring in some sort of roll for those. But the intent of always with most of the attributes is that you're not rolling most of the time, because while rolling can be fun, gamers like rolling. From a story element, if it just doesn't make sense to roll, like it's like, oh, I want to teleport. Okay, roll your dice. Oh, you failed, so you don't teleport. It's like, I try again.
Oh, that's so boring.
Like it's not fun taking away abilities, taking away someone's what they can do. That's typically not a fun thing. Now, you may have a character concept that says, oh yeah, my teleportation rarely works properly. So you've added on a limiter onto that. And so every time I want to use this ability, I have to roll. Well, then it's kind of fun because that's your story element of what your character is. Like, oh, I have something that doesn't function usually. That's fun. But typically, I would say, no, you don't need to do rolls for most things. And if you do your rolls, most of the time you do not add.
All right, and the next question comes from David Parker. Will you ever do a Twitch live stream of the game? And you can probably substitute Twitch for YouTube or Facebook or whatever live stream of your choice.
So this is something that's certainly come up, and then there's been a lot of requests on this type of stuff, and certainly I get it. Now, from an instructional point of view, there is value in showing people certain things. To be honest, I mean, I've loaded up like 3 or 4 hour role playing sessions. I have no clue how people sit through. Oh, my kids will watch watch YouTube videos of other people playing video games, and I just don't get it. Like I've tried, and like I love role playing, but I do not want to watch other people role play. That is not interesting. But other people, hey, there's a reason why there's a fan following for that. So can it be something I can do? And it's certainly not out of the range of possibility, but there's several reasons why that isn't as feasible. One, doing something badly for when you're a company, not when you're like just average gamers, you're fans, you're doing things for fun. There's lots of people that do that stuff. When you're doing things at the company, often there is an image that I want to portray and I want to maintain, and I don't want to do things badly. If I do something, I typically want to do a pretty decent job, which means it takes effort, it takes quality, it takes some forethought on what you're going to do. Even with something like streaming a role-playing session, I would want to do it only if I can do it well. And there are some real problems right now with COVID, obviously. And it's not to say you have to do things face-to-face. I am a face-to-face gamer. That's my preference. By far, that's my preference. And I would love to do something like, when you look at Vin Diesel's D&D type that I do, like we have a room set up in a studio with proper lighting, proper microphones, multiple different camera angles, and you're sitting around a table and you're doing something. That would be pretty sweet. Like I would agree.
That would be really sweet.
That would be great. Not with Vin Diesel, but if he wants to come, he's more than welcome. And I'd love to do that, but the cost of doing that, the time commitment, and it can't be done with COVID currently. So I have thought of it, and I looked. It's like, well, what is better use of my time? If I have an extra 10 hours, should I spend 10 hours trying to do something about this video, or should I spend 10 hours working on more game product or promotion, or honestly, spending time with the family? Like everyone's going a little crazy getting locked up here, and maybe my kids need to go to the park, go for a walk or something. And so I do have to look at the balance, because we're a micro company. We are so small. We can't do what Wizards of the Coast does, or Renegade Games, WizKids. Like we are small, micro size. And so everything I have to decide, do I want to put a certain amount of time, money, effort into doing X, or is it good to sit back and let the community handle it? So people will say, oh, can you do a video on this, creating character, or talking about this particular thing? And yet I find the most impactful for a lot of the stuff is not having it come from me, but having it come from fans and people who are consumers of these products. And I find those can be really, really good doing that. And I would much rather have a bunch of players playing BESM and recording it and doing it through Zoom or whatever, and then uploading it to Twitch, and maybe they already have a channel established, and doing it that way, and really encouraging people to go and watch those, because that's authentic and that is what players are doing. there's an advantage for me doing it because, well, Mark's a designer. Mark's going to have a certain unique perspective. I want to see the official company line on that. And hey, I get that. Although doing online gaming or face-to-face if COVID disappears, but doing that and doing it well is a fairly substantial undertaking. And at this point, we just don't have the capacity to do that. And in addition, there's also, again, something to think about. And maybe it's overthinking things too much, but I am a politician as well. I do sit on city council. And so representation matters as well. Do I want to have 5 white guys on a screen role playing? Or if I'm going to do it, am I going to do it correctly? I want to make sure that there's good representation and there's diversity. And so now it's suddenly there's other aspects I have to consider. And what if in order to give the best representation that I think something deserves, if it's going to have a company voice behind it, if I'm going to do that correctly, then it's going to take even more effort than me just getting together with my friends, which are traditionally over 40 white males. Like that's kind of my gamer group. And it's not that I don't know anyone that doesn't fit in that category, but I think if I wanted to do something representational of this is an official company product of showing live streaming, I think representation matters, and I want to make sure I do it. If you're a gamer group and this is your gamer friends and you're doing things, it doesn't have that, to me, it doesn't have the same expectation. It doesn't have the same importance of when a company does something. I think it has, and maybe I'm overthinking things, but it's part of my job of being a politician. It's part of my job being company representative to make sure that we're doing things correctly. And I don't want to do something unless I can do it. So that is my thoughts. When you look at I'm trying to do a little bit more video on doing some things now that BESM is kind of out, which is doing that 6 video series about creating a character. It's not an incredible amount of detail, and I might do some different videos later going into like a specific detail on a specific character, for example. But if you're looking at those, I ended up buying the backdrop, getting that made up so I can have a professional backdrop. I have a pro level mic. We have lighting here. And so if I'm going to do a video representing from the company, I want to make sure it's done as good as it can possibly do. And so everything that I put out, I don't want to do something and someone say, Mark could have done better. I'm not going to be the best. I have limitations. I'm not a professional film editor. And so I'm not going to be able to do everything. I'm not going to be able to animate things the way some other people can. But if I put my stamp on it as the Scammy rep to say, this is an official product, then I want it to be as good as possible. And at this point, I don't feel I can do that with live streaming at this point. That may change, and there's some things I'm exploring maybe with stretch goals, because stretch goals for next Kickstarter, as an example, that allows me to get some of the funds to do something. So if we need a certain funding level and we go above that, one of the stretch goals could be to do some of these video stuff, because now I have those funds above and beyond what I was expecting, and I can spend that to bring some extra equipment in. You give some money to people who are, if you're going to be role playing with me and this is going to be promoting the company, well, maybe I want to pay certain people. I'm not talking about like professional actors and going to a studio to make sure I get the Vin Diesel types. No, I still want it to be authentic, but there is the consideration of stipends for people to do something. And maybe a stretch goal for Kickstarter is the way to go. So it's a very, very long answer. It was a very short question. My answer was very long, but I wanted to give you some context of why it's like, why doesn't Discami do X? And there are good reasons. Primarily, it's I want to produce product more than I want to do videos about playing the product, which is why in the next Kickstarter we actually have 6 different products that are going to be released in that Kickstarter. Some of them are just print editions of things that were done in the first Kickstarter, but there's some interesting things there. I mean, extras took a fair amount of time to do, and there's some other products that we have that are pretty neat. And I've been working on games that people don't know anything about yet, because I haven't told anybody about that are ready to come out for next year as well, that I'll be talking a little bit on the Kickstarter. So my time is well spent doing content at this point. And so, yeah, I know it's not the answer you wanted, but it's an honest answer.
Honest answers are always the best answers, because otherwise you have to remember what lies you told other people.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, that's good.
Another question from the Phantom of the Tabletop: is BESM Extras Volume 2 a possibility for more expanded content?
So at this point, no. In terms of kind of the multi-genre rules, like multi-genre rules being something that has universal applicability. Called shots are kind of universal, regardless of the genre, the type of game you're running. You have a cooking game, you can still do called shots, right? And it doesn't matter if it's fantasy or science fiction or what. There's not more content in a universal applicability that I think really needs to volume. Certainly not another 144-page volume. Like I just can't imagine there being extras volume. But there are aspects that can be done in future books, and this where the multiverse book comes in, and maybe the different world books would come in. So when you're getting to be more specific, say fantasy, well, there are aspects of magic, example, or interactions with adventuring equipment, or things that are specific to a fantasy world that I can see, yeah, maybe there's a few more rules or suggestions we can have, but it's not universal in its applicability. So it should probably go into the multiverse book as an example of what it would be in the multiverse in Icarus, for example, or maybe in Cathedral, which is our space opera type setting. Well, here's some rules around technology that are applicable specifically to a game like Cathedral. It doesn't be Cathedral itself, but it's in space opera. It's fantasy in a science fiction setting. So yes, there will be more rules, and certainly going to be more items and more NPCs and more monsters and content like that. Undoubtedly, magic systems, there are a lot of different ways we can explore magic systems, and we have more that we provided in extras under what we're calling packs and bundles, and we have some really interesting things in power bundles and power packs but again, that was designed with an eye towards universal. So the intention was always to consider extras as almost like a core book. So there's really 3 core books for BESM. BESM Core, BESM Naked, which are 2 core books. They do the same thing, but I consider fundamental core essential books. You only need one, but they're essential. And then the third one is extras. Extras is your DMG to your player's handbook, or your monster manual to your player's handbook. Like you need it, I think, as part of the complete package. And the question could be, why didn't you put it in the core book if it needs to be in the core book? Well, because it is more complex, because it would have made the book almost 500 pages, which is just crazy for something how could I say BESM is a rules-like game when it's a 500-page book with tons of really complex rules in comparison to what the core rules are. So it didn't make sense to put in the part of in the core game. It makes sense to have that as an optional rules, but I do consider it as one of the fundamental core books to have. So you want to have your core or your naked, and you want to have extra. But
so it's
the
like
next
the
books
question. If you can only have one, which one do you get? Well, you get either core or naked. If you can have 2, which you get, well, then you add on extras.
Yeah. I'd always suggest that X would be great, because there's something in there for almost everyone's games, even if you don't like the high level of complexity on grappling, for example. I don't want grappling rules. I just want to use attack combat value and defense combat values. Hey, great, no problem. You can easily do that. You don't need to use the grappling rules. But maybe you might like some of the range penalties, for example. It's like, well, what if I'm firing a bow really far? Well, we talk about that. So I do consider it fundamental going forward after extras. So the multiverse book was always intended to, it is the setting book, and obviously it's called the multiverse. It is a setting book, but it's also an example through the settings of things that are needed in there. So it provides you the setting information, and it provides you also information about a fantasy role-playing world that you can use in your fantasy role-playing world that is not the same as Icarus, or your science fiction world that is not Imago or is not Cathedral. But it gives you that fundamental understanding. And then past there were the individual world books, what people might call splat books back from the White Wolf days. So there could be an individual Icarus book, an individual Imago or Enid or Bazaroth. They could have their own books, which are also genre examples. So the Bazaroth book should have lots of stuff about that's applicable to horror in general. And like the sanity rules, we did put it in extras, something like sanity obviously plays into horror style games, and that's the type of thing that can go in Bazaroth, where you could say, well, it's part of Bazaroth. No, it's part of the genre, and the genre is expressed through a specific application within the BESM multiverse, and that's why we can have individual splat books for them. So there's plans for more, no doubt. There's plans, but
they are not going to be endless rules. Like that's kind of not what we're doing right here, right? Like this is, it's not a rules heavy game. And so Extras Volume 2, probably not going to happen.
Saber Expert asks, does using teleport require an action, or is it a part of a character's movement?
Somewhat does depend on the situation. In general, if I was to say teleport, like it's like, oh, I'm going to teleport in behind them and attack them. Oh, cool. Go ahead. Like that's a part of movement thing, in my opinion. But other people maybe looking at teleport is something like you can just think of different TV shows or anime shows where when people teleport, maybe it takes them a little bit of time at the beginning to just kind of get set up to do it. And then when they land, then it takes them a few moments to kind of integrate on where they are and what they're doing. And so you can say, well, that's kind of a whole round to do the teleportation. Even if the actual teleporting is instantaneous, it's the whole effect could be around. But in other games where people are running and teleporting and it's like it's just a part of their movement, think of, say, X-Men, Nightcrawler, right? Like his Banff ability is clearly part of his general movement. And that's a teleportation. And I would not say that takes an action. Like that's just part of how he moves. So somewhat situational. You'd have to also say, well, is this something that is from the economy of actions, which is always something to consider. Is that reasonably an economy of actions that they should spend a whole action doing it? And if the group thinks, yeah, it is that important that it probably should take your whole action, then do it. If not, no, it's, the economy in actions is not there. It's just an expression of a movement. And so just keep it as that would be my take.
And I mean, if you were to try to, like teleport twice, then yeah, probably using up one of your actions for the extra range would probably be a good idea.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. Someone's like, oh, well, I want to teleport a kilometer. I'm just going to teleport my 100 meters 10 times. And because it's just movement, I can do it in one round. It's like, well, no, you're cheating. No, no, I'm not going to allow you to abuse the system like that. So situational is what it is.
Yep. All right. So HR Segovia asks, I thought I saw something regarding acrylic figurines. What other accessories do we have to look forward to, i.e. figures, dice towers, trays, etc.?
Yeah, great question. So the acrylic figurines are that's not BESM. That is Japanime Games does acrylic for the Tokyo Sidekick. Acrylic is super expensive to do compared to the thing. So we do have 2D Animini's. So 2D Animini's is the very less expensive version of miniatures. Now, consider BESM is not a tabletop style game, maps and 5-foot squares or anything like that. You can turn it into there, but typically we're a lot more hand waving in there. But I do recognize, even when I'm playing, sometimes it's nice to have something on a table that just kind of shows how things. And so we did over 100 different monsters and characters and mech and animals that are art that is from the BESM, and we shrunk them down and put them on punch boards. And from these punch boards, you now have access to a huge number of minis, which are not minis. They're actually just physical representations on a board. But to do the pricing of this, like if we wanted to do plastic minis, like actual plastic, we're just too small to do something like that in this volume of like 100 different characters down there. In the history of what I've worked on, I mean, when we did Silver Age Sentinels, we did a group to pewter back then. No one does pewter. But that was kind of neat. We had Sandra Garrity sculpt them, and they were based on the main characters from the Silver Age Sentinels universe, and that was fun. And we could certainly maybe go a route at some point and do minis, but it is a little bizarre putting money into doing minis when you don't have a game that supports mini, because that's not what it is. Perhaps a better extrapolation at some point for minis was we might take the BESM IP and do a board game of some sort in the future. It's always been something that is on the possibility. The board games maybe might have miniatures as the components for those. I'm not talking like a full-on Warhammer 40K or anything like that. Just sometimes you can just have minis. And that's a way for us to get BESM minis out there, but it's through the expression of them. So that's a possibility. But at this point, in the BESM Extras Kickstarter, one of the product, the 2D Anime, is a $35 product, 5 different punchboard flats. Once you punch them out, you're going to have a collection of bases. And this is something that you can use in any of your games when you're just having some sort of representation. It's not essential. because not everyone want to have these physical representations. And certainly, if you already have minis, you can always just use what you have, whether painted or unpainted, or that sort of Pathfinder. They have flats as well, so you could use anything for that. But this was a BESM way to do it. It's a nice product. And it's going to be part of the Kickstarter. People want to Kickstarter for it, great. If they want to buy it in the store, great. If they don't want it, that's fine too. But it is part of the BESM. So great question, HR. At this point, acrylics are not. I mean, we're looking at you doing 20 acrylics and you're charging like 50. That's just really expensive. More affordable, and printed cardboard punch outs are really effective.
All right, and next question is from Gray Pix. Do you have any plans to translate at least the core rules into any other language?
Oh, we would love to see that, but we won't be doing the translating. So we would license out. Whenever we did BESM D20, we had a company that did it was a Spanish language, and so they licensed it and they did a BESM D20 in Spanish version. We are happy to work with companies worldwide to license them the rights to do a French version or in Japanese. I think the ultimate would have BESM in Japan would be just so weird and so meta, in some ways so embarrassing as well. But I think that, yeah, we're certainly interested, but we're not going to do it. We don't have the local expertise to understand like what the German anime RPG market might be, or Portuguese or French. But I would love to work with these other companies because we can give them all the art, all the text, and say, hey, go ahead, translate it and produce it in your own language. So their development time will be significantly less. Yes, they have a licensing fee, but that'll more be made up by the fact that they don't have to do all the work to put everything together. So I'm hopeful that we will have more languages, but as of right now, we don't have any signed contracts that we're ready to enact with it. So we're still hopeful that something will come from that. But a lot of these connections are made at conventions. And that's been a lot more difficult. We didn't have our normal business meetings at Gen Con this year, and I don't even know if we're going to have them next year. So we'll wait and see. So it may be a little bit later, but I'm hoping it's going to come.
Alrighty. And I, for one, would love to see it in more languages also, because, being from Canada, I'm sure there are a lot of French-speaking people who'd love to play.
Oh, yeah.
And do it in their native languages. In another RPG community I'm in, one of the moderators is French Quebec, and he's in the process of doing a lot of translations for not the core books, but a lot of the fan-made supplements that there's a big French community. French-speaking people love playing games. We need more French material.
Yes.
But next question is from Blue Tressum. As you've mentioned, COVID has meant a lot more people gaming online, and the use of virtual tabletops has vastly increased. Would you consider licensing the rule set to one of the VTT creators so that BESM 4E can be officially supported by them and use all their cool tools? They've been using a VTT for years and be so much easier and faster if it could actually use the full functionality.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of options out there. By far the biggest one is Roll20. I won't say whether it's the best. We need to decide. And we've had requests. It's like, hey, can you get the character sheet on Roll20? Well, a lot of the Roll20 character sheets that are driven by individual companies doing things. That said, one of the stretch goals that we are going to do for that we might unlock perhaps for the BESM Extras Kickstarter is if we have a little bit of extra funds, then actually hiring someone to do the for a really good BESM 4th edition character is something that we're willing to put a little bit of money behind if we have some funds from the Kickstarter, because it's not something, we can't ask people to do stuff for free. And I also don't want to have people I do it on the side and I can dabble in this. If we're going to do it, I don't mind paying someone to do it well and to do a really good job of it. Everyone has their different skill sets, and some people are really good at doing sheets on that. So it is something we're open to considering, even if I personally don't role play through Roll20. A lot of people do. And you could say, oh, but my favorite system is this one, Fantasy Grounds, or my favorite system is something else. It's like, well, yeah, but we can't do everything. And if we're going to support one with some finances to pay someone to create something, then we would stick with one. And I think Roll20, we've decided that we're going to support in that way. But there has to be, it is a lot of money to do something like that. And when we look at other stretch goals that are a lot less expensive because we can do them in-house or they're different knowledge set. So it's not going to be one of the earlier stretch goals. But yeah, Roll20 character sheet something we've definitely considered for BESM. Of course, at any time a fan can do it, but that's not something we can rely on. And I also don't know how well it's going to be. So I would rather have it done really well and get it done. So that would be my
Okay. Yeah. And honestly, it's tough trying to get in on those because most of them require you to pay in order to make your rule set and character sheets and stuff. So it's not like something you can just knock out in an afternoon or something. It takes time and money and some knowledge. And some of those virtual tabletops are, they've been added to over the years and are just very convoluted and don't really work all that well.
Yeah, precisely.
It's just it's not easy, and you need to make sure that you have someone who knows what they're doing. So you're looking at paying a professional, which it's cool hearing that it's one of the stretch goals. I personally think that Discord works just fine, but I'm very much theater of the mind. Let me just throw up here's a picture to give you an idea of what the scene is like, and then we'll just talk it out theater of the mind. I don't need maps or anything, but people love maps for some reason.
They do, and some of the character sheet functionality, 20 could be quite interesting. I mean, I've had people walk me through what they do in their games and how their character. And I'm like, oh, that's pretty interesting. Again, it might not be how I would do it, but I can see that there's a real draw for the scenario. So yeah, it's something we're willing to explore. Money allows us to bump up in the timeline. It was always something I had thought of that we would want to do in some form. But it's going to take back seat to other things that can make it maybe a little bit more money to keep the company going. So if there's some extra cash that comes through a Kickstarter, then it just allows us to reprioritize and your cost towards something. And that's the same with people say, oh, well, why don't you X or why don't you do Y? It's like, well, we can, but money allows us to hire people that maybe, rather than me writing something or me working on something, I can hire someone, or me having to learn a new skill set to do something and do something like that. It's money allows us to reprioritize. It allows us to bump things up. It allows us to multitask. So rather than us being able to hire a certain number of people to work things in more linear fashion, I can hire 2 or 3 and they can work in parallel. So that's one of the real strengths that it comes with doing Kickstarters or crowdfunding like that it's in many ways the fans can kind of determine how quickly we can get stuff done. That's not saying it's like, well, if it's our business model and something that's good for us, shouldn't we be the one funding in and doing it? It's like, yeah, well, ultimately, yes, of course. But then we're going to have to work at the pace that makes the most amount of sense for our company based on the finances, based on the sales and whatnot. And if the fans want to see something happen a little bit differently and maybe on a different timeline or to go in a slightly different direction, then effectively voting with dollars is, it does work.
All right. And we have another question from Saber Expert on BESM Extras, which came up as a discussion, I think, last week in the server here is, can you tell us how the knockback mechanics work?
Oh, yeah, sure. That's no problem. So it's not overly complex how knockback works. It is going to seem relatively familiar to people that have been around the BESM stuff in 59. So knockback, if you're using it as an optional rule, not everything is going to do knockback. So if you're using knockback, then there's a bunch of different things you can add in. For example, there's combat techniques that allow you to. There's a knockback as a weapon enhancement to add into it to indicate that this is a knockback. So it's not a default. Like a sword swing is typically not. But if you have a sword swing that has the knock enhancement on it, then you're implying a certain thing about what that means. And so if you're going to use knockback as a concept, I want to knock back and we're going to use the rules, then there are numerous different elements that you have to apply. Then you have, on a very straight level, is going to be your impact damage. And basically, knockbacks are, and so it's core level. It's for every point of impact damage you're getting, then you're going back a meter and knock up to. No, sorry, it's been a while since I looked.
Well, you should just post a screenshot in the chat so we can all see it.
Oh yeah, there we go. And the reason why I was like, why can't I find this information? So yeah, you are knocked back, 1 meter for every point of damage. But then of course it's going to be reduced by your body stat in meters. And then you have for different things. So for example, folds could, but if you were to look at it, it's like, what's the base rule? It's 1 meter per point of damage minus your body. That's kind of the easiest way to say it. So if you're thinking of your fists, so that's a level 0 weapon. You're punching someone. So all you're doing is your attack combat value. And then someone's body stat can be subtracted. So most of the time, if you're punching someone, you're going to be knocking them back. It's only for things that are kind of a little bit bigger, a little bit grander, and something you actually maybe put some points into it, effectively putting through a combat technique enhancement, that those are all forms of points. You also consider that the knockback does not normally involve your attack combat value. It is the base damage of the weapon. So if you're hitting someone with your fist, unless you also took the enhanced knockback combat technique, if you're just hitting someone with your fist, there's no potential for knockback because there's 0 based. Now, if you had super strength or a weapon that your fists actually level 3, well then okay, that is 15 because it applies 5. You're doing 15 as your base damage. Body of 7. I'm going to be subtracting that, and so I'll get knocked back. And what is the impact of that? Well, you'd look up, and then there's talks about impact. What do you run into? Is there any damage associated with it? A lot of it is stuff that you could say, well, I want knockback as a concept in my game, but I don't want to use rules for it. And say, great. So someone punches up to someone, with super strength, and the person flies through the air and lands into the in wall and breaks through it and comes out the other side, and the punch does 10 points of damage, and the wall, you're going to do another 5 points of damage because you went through the wall. There you go. Like, I didn't use any rules. I just kind of role played it, and I just did what kind of made sense. So you could have knockback without using a mechanical rule set, but that gives you a brief understanding of what the rule set is going to be. Again, not that different from what previous games were.
All right, and the next question is from H.R. Segovia. Has White Wolf discussed any World of Darkness crossover material or allowing World of Darkness material for use in Emporium?
No, there will be nothing. We are in a completely different category. Even White Wolf, which is now Paradox. Paradox does not publish White Wolf books. They do not publish World of Darkness stuff. Other companies do. So the company that owns the rights to all this stuff do not do publishing. And there's no way that they would allow anyone to sandbox that. I mean, we could do it with SAS Absolute Power in second edition. Absolute Power and BESM, we could do a crossover that if we wanted to, because we're the same publisher on both of them. But no, there'll be no specific.
So I'm actually going to ask you one of my questions because I'm the moderator. I can do whatever the heck I want to. One of the things that I'm looking forward to is the power packs and bundles. You've talked about it vaguely before, where it's like just a collection of enhancements and limiters that have to be applied to the appropriate attributes. Can you talk about like the genesis of those, where that kind of came from, and what kind of things we can see for those? Because it looks like we have 12, 13 pages of them.
Yeah, so power packs and bundles are very... So kind of the origins of power packs, which we do go into a little bit on third edition about them. It's kind of an expansion. When in terms of the origins, it's back with me playing D&D when I was a kid, where you have your spells, you got your somatic components, you got your material components, you got your verbal components. Think of your standard kind of fantasy wizards. They have a spell book, and they're going to cast a spell, and it's going to take a certain amount of time, and they have to have this rare herb to do it, and they have to wave their hands in a certain way, and they have to so that what you don't want to do is it's like, okay, I have teleportation, and I have mind control, and I have flight, and I have this and then that, and I have to write down all of these 7, 6, 5 limiters on every single attribute. Well, you could do that, or you could just say that you have for example, the Wizard Power Pack. So the Wizard Power Pack, I'm just up here. So the Wizardry Power Pack, for example, has consumable +1, so 1 level of consumable. So you need a focus to do it, like your herb, for example. You have deplete +2, so it takes 20 energy points, or -5 around, depending on the application. If you're flying, it'll be -5 points around, or if you're just doing a teleport, it's -20 energy points. You have detectable, so it's 1. So loud chanting or calling a spell name, so you're going to have your verbal components. And then you have potent -1, and that's that you get a minor edge on your roll. So in total, Wizardry is a +3 collection of limiters, which means every single attribute you apply this to has a +3. So if you buy teleport at level 1, it functions at level 4 if you have the Wizardry power. That's how they were set up. And we just give 6 different examples. You can create any one you want, but we created them what we thought is like divine is more like your cleric type. Psi is going to be your mental thought. Well, your chrysalist, which is a new one. These are someone that uses a lot of crystals, healing energy of crystals that they have in the resonance from those. Your ritualist, of course, is someone that has to go through the very precise steps on to cast a ritual. And your shamanist is someone that's calling upon, the spirits in the other realms. And so these are just 6 different packs we put together. It's a lot easier to give an example of every one of my attributes is I use my ritualist powers to do these attributes. Great. It's a +7. It's massive. Now you can apply potent 2 extra ones together, but it's just a collection of them, and it kind of shows you what to do. It's as much as a tutorial about how you do it for your own game as anything else. Because maybe in your game, wizards, maybe they don't have spell components. Maybe they don't have things that they have to use, but they do still have the verbal, and maybe they do have the arm waving aspect that you have to do it. So you think of different anime shows that you watch where this person can't cast their spells because someone tied their hands, and that's how magic works in their realm. You need to be able to use your hands. My hands are tied together. I can't cast it. Or maybe I take away your voice, and if you can't speak the name of the spell, you can't cast the spell, right? So that's what power packs are. Where Bundles are really, the easy way to describe them is they're spells. Because people say, how do I do magic? How do I do magic? Well, magic is dynamic powers. Or magic is any attribute is magic. Flight can be magic if you just say, my flight is magic. But what power bundles are is they're a collection of your spells. This is the closest thing we actually have to the spell. So, or think of if you happen to have any of the older licensed stuff. So your Slayers and all the spells in the Slayers show for that. This is a collection of spells that we divide into different categories to say, well, these are conjuration type spells, evocation type spells, and we purposely kind of organize them in a way that's going to be familiar enough to D&D players. Like, oh yeah, of course, evocation. I understand that. I know what conjuration is. So people can conjure, for example, a dark mist. There's a conjuration bundle, which is dark mist. Now, what is it? Well, it's just control environment level 1, darkness, with a duration -2. And environment, there can be no wind or sunlight. So the text is a harmless black mist wraith fills the immediate area for 1 hour, blocking light and vision. Well, that's just simple control environment. But this shows you how to create a spell-like effect, which we're not calling spells because spells imply magic, and these aren't magic. These are power bundles. So this is like a spell, but it doesn't have to be magic. It just could be a way of doing an expression of a power. And so we have, with the 6 different categories, 10 of each. So we give 60 different effectively magic spells or expressions of attributes. And these are very precise collections. So this is the difference between your lightning bolt, your magic missile, and your fireball. They could each be in here, this book, because they are a very specific expression of how they function. Where most of the time, if you didn't use the power bundles, you would just use weapon and you'd create it on your own. Well, this is designed to make things a little bit easier. And again, not just designed to use like this is 60, that's all I have. Well, it's not to say this is the limiting factor. This is to show you how you now do it. And now you can do your own.
So it's just a bunch of tutorials on how to use what's already there.
Yeah. Yeah, in the same way, though, in the items and weapon chapter, chapter 8, where we give 20, I think there's 71 or 72 items in there, over 20 pages. And it's not to say like, oh, here's the Space Fury. It is a vehicle. It flies in space. It's little starfighter, be it your X-wing or your Star Fury from Babylon 5 or whatever. Like it is that type of ship. And that's not to say that's the only ship you can possibly have, but now I can see how it's created. Now, when I make my own X-wing fighters, Y-wing fighters, or any kind of ship like that, I can refer to all these numerous examples to see how the designer did it. And now, when I do it on my own, I'll remember what I have to.
Just kind of scrolling through here. There was a question earlier about any update on a BESM LARP edition.
Yeah, so LARP is very interesting. So LARP was always never going to be one of the first books done. It always we had to get the foundations done of the core book plus X, and then we could work on LARP. But one of the really interesting things about LARP is it involves lots of people standing very close together. I don't know when that is going to happen again. So LARP as a concept is great. I want to do some more playtesting of that, and I can't playtest that game. Even if I wrote all the rules today, I would have to put them in a virtual shelf and just let it sit there until I can actually do more with it. So LARP in my head was a 2021, late 2021, maybe SummerCon season 2021, or maybe 2022. That was the intention always in my head of when it would get done. I don't know, quite frankly. Is this going to be years of physical distancing? Don't know. Maybe next summer everything's going to be fine. So it'll happen. I want to do the LARP. I think it's great, but it's mainly for running at conventions and really awesome family reunions if you have like really cool relatives. But that's not going to be happening anytime soon. Anything that is other than face to face, because it involves a lot of stuff about consent and how do you run combat. What do you do with spectators walking by, and like there's going to be so many things other than just the rule set, because the rule set is basically BESM, right? Like it's I'm not creating a whole new rule set. It's taking BESM and taking the core elements of there, so that you can do have Ranma and Sailor Moon and Goku and all these things in one game. How do you do that? Well, I've done it with Amber at conventions where you can run many different power levels and have everyone in one. And I've run superhero LARPs using very free-flowing systems. So I'd like to have it for BESM as well, but it's definitely been put on the back burners because of what's happening right now.
That makes perfect sense. And
yeah,
safety first, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, there's no option, right? If there's no convention being run, why? Who cares about a LARP book if you can't meet people? Like, so it's weird. I never would have put that on the list of potential risks whenever I was coming up with the idea of doing LARP. It was never a concept that there might be a medical reason why.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that snuck up on everybody.
Yeah, pretty well. So I haven't forgot about it. Still like to do it, but I've been pivoting in other directions, and we have some other really awesome stuff. In some ways, I'm ahead by about a year of where I thought I'd be with some of the work, because a lot of time that I didn't have before, because I'm not seeing anyone. So because of that, I've managed to move ahead really far with some of the production and bring some stuff in the production list that I didn't know I'd be doing, partially because I'm not doing other things like.
All right, and we do have a question from Cookie Kitty UKE. Honestly, Cookie, I'm sorry, I don't quite know if you're supposed to pronounce it all together or if it's 3 letters at the end, so I apologize. But she asks, have you gotten any closer to the licensed anime book?
Closer? Yes. However,
probably one of those things you can't talk about, right?
You can't talk about. In some ways closer, some ways further. Couple different options. It's underway in the works. But what I have done is the concept of how to do the license has been taken care of. So that I've gone through the steps needed to understand how a game would function and how we put together, because it is not anything we've done in the past. I think it needs to have a different approach. We've done it that way now, and so whenever we are ready to move ahead with stuff, we can move much more quickly. It has also, because of COVID and companies were locked down, like people weren't meeting. There's many companies that they don't show up at offices anymore, and so having licensing meetings in Japan, they just aren't happening in the same way anymore. So it hasn't stopped, but it hasn't been as far advanced as
And I think that's kind of a general catch-all for what's the news on this? Well, COVID.
Yeah, well, and it's true. It really is true. That's messed up a lot.
Yeah. Looks like a lot of the more recent questions are specific. How do I do X?
Right.
And we kind of mentioned that we were going to avoid those questions today.
Yeah, that's smart. That's because it can be a lot of time, and sometimes people have very specific questions that the community can answer, for example, and especially people who are a little bit newer might have some questions that people who are more experienced with the system might be able to pop out. And of course, people will see that I'm on the Discord not irregularly. I check it every day, and if something I think could use my thoughts, then I'll pop in and give them. But otherwise, I'm happy to step back and let.
Yeah, because we do have the BESM Help Center
Yeah.
chat channel for that specific thing. And your time is limited, and we had allocated about 2 hours for this, and we're almost at the 2-hour mark. So I don't really want to open the floodgates of how do I do X, how do I do
Yeah,
Y.
no, that's probably smart. Are there many other kind of general type questions, or
if anybody asked a question that was not how do I do X and it hasn't been answered, please retype your question. Because we tried to keep up, but there has been enough chatter as well as question asking. So I think next time we'll have a specific post your question here channel so that we just keep that separate from the general chat so we can better keep track of it. This is only the second time we've done this, so I'm still learning as a moderator, and things have been a little crazy with Discord being weird. So
yeah. So I had noticed that HR had asked something about the Easter eggs on that, and I won't. Easter eggs, I guess, are just somewhat like little silly things put in there. Certainly, people will pick up on different things that they'll see on their own. So I'm not going to talk about what all the Easter eggs are. Yeah, the index is a great place where if you look at magic, I'll point you somewhere, even though there's no magic in the game. So I'll point you to the dynamic powers for you. But there's references to different anime shows and non-anime shows, general science fiction, fantasy, and you might come across something in the core book in there. So it's not that I have a list of them that to say. I just know that when I was writing them, that there are some things in there that it's like, oh yeah, that was a reference to this particular show, and someone may find them and think it's funny. It'd be interesting if anyone actually comes across them and posts them somewhere, just to see if anyone had noticed it. But yeah, I don't have a specific this HR. So let me talk a little bit about, just because time is getting a little bit short, about what the future is going to be. So as I've been mentioning, so November 10th is the new BESM Extras Kickstarter. That are our 6 products that are being released. So BESM Extras is kind of the focus of it, 144-page hardcover. We have Dramatis Personae, which were originally done. Peter Flanagan, who's actually, I see he's on the list here, and he was the one that wrote those as 4 individual free products that we came as stretch goals. But what we've done is we've taken the 4, combined them, added another dozen, and putting them into a hardcover. So someone can say, "Oh, I have all the PDFs. I don't need them, and I don't care about the new stuff." Yeah, that's great. You don't need the back. But if you want a 144-page full color hardcover of 71 NPCs, discussion about organizations as well, then it's another great product. So the 144, that's the size. So you got your 352, which is your core book, and then Naked is 144, Extras is 144, and Dramatis Personae is 144. It's a really good size, and allows us to keep the price at 35. In addition to those, we have the 2D Animini's, as I mentioned, which is we have the Adventures #1, which is something we were always planning to do for the line, and we did it as a freebie, as again a thank you for a stretch goal that we put out for Carousel Obscura. It's a 32-page adventure, and we released that part of the PDF of the free one. Well, we have it in print now, of course, so if someone again wants a print edition of it, they can back that in the Kickstarter. If they don't, great, you don't need to back for it. So that will be in there. And then we have the BESM Dice Tower and dice trays. So this is something new. I've never done these before, and this was kind of inspired by Wingspan, the board game that Stonemaier Games came out with. It's a great little game, and there's a little birdhouse. So it's a dice rolling dice tower made of cardboard, and you punch it out and you put it together, and it allows you to roll your dice. So it's like, wow, that is awesome. So I want to do that for BESM. We have dice, so sometimes when you roll your dice and they roll across the table, and maybe you don't have spaces at premium. So we combined a package, which is a 2-punch boards, which you punch it all out and you create a dice tower, which is a scene. It's a tree from, well, actually, why don't I give a sneak peek of it? I'm just going to comment just for it. Quick moment. And I think, I can put it in the text forum. So, yeah, so I'll...
if you wanted to do a screen share, you can do that.
No, I won't do that. I'll just put an image into...
Okay.
There we go. So this is the first picture of the dice tower. So it is a constructible dice tower. That is a beautiful scene, which is actually a tree from Aradia that there's actually a water slide inside the tree. And that's where you kind of roll your dice in the tree, and it's going down the water slide, and it goes into a lake. And then it comes with 2 dice trays, which are the neoprene dice trays with the button, the little snaps that you put together. That they're flat, but you can put it together. And this is a way to roll your dice if you don't want to use a tower. And so the package is $35, and it comes with a constructible dice tower, which stands roughly 20, just a little bit less, say 5 inches tall. And you can roll your dice in there. It keeps it nice and compact. You got a couple of really gorgeous neoprene dice trays. And so this is a fun package. Does anyone need this? No one needs this. Just like you don't need BESM dice that are just D6s. Anyone has D6s. But it's kind of neat if you want to actually have them, right? So that's another package that we're putting together. So all of these together are 6 different products that are part of the Kickstarter. You can back for all of them in physical. Anyone that backs physical gets the PDFs as well. Or you can just back for PDFs for some of them. Obviously, a dice tower PDF is kind of useless. So we're only offering the things that are reasonable that you'd actually have the PDF. You can back it for that. And then in the Kickstarter, when we run it, we're also offering everything that was part of the initial Kickstarter, other than the dice. You can't buy those in the mail works, but you could add it in a package. So you can get at the end, this Kickstarter, when everything runs, there's going to be 12 different BESM products. And the best thing about this is everything's printed already. It's done. And we're going to be, some of it is on its way and it's going to be shipping now. By the time the Kickstarter is over, the product should be stateside already. And the reason why we did this is twofold. The biggest reason is to make up for the fact that we screwed up the first Kickstarter and it was way too late. I did not want everyone waiting for, let's get the Kickstarter and then we send the books to print and then we wait. So now when this Kickstarter ends in December, barring exact shipping times, our plan is to ship the entire package of the pledges in December, physical copies. You'll get obviously the digital copies immediately. And if things proceed really well with customs and with the exact shipping of the timelines, people can have the Kickstarter products in their hand for Christmas. That was the goal. Now, it might not turn out exactly like that. But if we are looking so everything's printed. So you can say, well, how can you do stretch goals on stuff if stuff is printed? Well, certainly you can't. I can't change the physical aspect of the book, which is why I went ahead and unlocked some stretch goals in advance of the campaign. So we are going to be asking for 10,000 funding, not a lot. That's what we're asking. And I think that was kind of the minimum amount that I'd say it was a successful Kickstarter that got us enough funds to get the bulk of the stuff at press. And then I have unlocked the UV spot gloss coating on the 2 core hardcovers, the BESM Extras and Dramatis Personae, as stretch goals, plus the ribbons. I think the ribbons were great in the core book, so I added those in to the other hardcovers and as stretch goals as well. And so we've already unlocked the stretch goal at 15,000, 20,000, 25,000. Even if we don't reach that, even if we only reach 10 and the campaign's funded, well, you've got some bonus stretch goals that run. Once we hit 30,000, if we go that high, and I take nothing for granted. I'm hopeful because we did a really successful first Kickstarter, but it's also COVID, right? It's different. So maybe people can't afford it. Maybe it's not the right time. No problem. 10,000 is the minimum that we kind of need to make this a successful Kickstarter. Otherwise, we're going to have to only release it through the retail. But if we get up to the 30, then we're starting unlocking as well. And so the UV coating and the ribbon were very popular with the first Kickstarter as a stretch goals, and I think it looks great. The core book, everyone talks about how good it looks, and so that is what we're planning with the Kickstarter. It's we haven't really talked about things, but I wanted to make sure that everyone knows that I took how badly the first Kickstarter went on the delivery of the physical products, how serious we took it. Yes, there was a COVID delay, but it went beyond that. And something as a way of kind of making it up is we printed them before the Kickstarter is done, and we wanted to get it in everyone's hands as soon as possible. So as soon as the Kickstarter is over, we're immediately jumping into the after a couple days, of course, because Kickstarter has. Then we'll jump into the Pledge Manager, and as soon as the Pledge Managers are done, then I'll be sending out digital copies right away, and hopefully within a few days after that to a week, we'll send out the physical copy and get them into people's hands as soon as possible. So by the end of 2020, 12 different BESM products will be available. And in the history of BESM, there's never been a bigger launch year than that. Like that is a massive amount of to all come out in 1 year. And specifically, it's within like a 3-month period. So super excited about that. So that's what's coming out immediately in the BESM Kickstarter. And then next year, what we have planned is, so I've already made an announcement about Absolute Power, which is Silver Age Sentinels, 2nd edition. Peter Flanagan is taking kind of the point on that. It's obviously based on Silver Age Sentinels, and so and based on BESM. So the BESM rule system, Silver Age Sentinels, was set in 2001. That's when the setting was and all the context there. Well, now it is 20 years later. The game starts in 2021. Which is why it's being written currently, and it will be updated as time goes on. What's happening in the election November? Well, that'll appear in the game, and so we are advancing it along. So the Guard, the main characters, the villains, the heroes, that you're used to, they are now 20 years older. And so things are different. Technology is different. The world has happened. Big things have happened during those 20 years. And that is one of our big releases next year. We're hoping for mid to late 2021. We're not going to rush it. We're going to make sure we're doing it right. We have some awesome new art updated because, characters don't stay looking the same. As even when SAS 1 came out, the Sentinel had 2 different versions. He had an older kind of golden age look that he had, and then he changed his costume. Well, he's changed it again. In the SAS 1, he used to be called the American Sentinel, and he was unhappy with how that went. He wanted more global appeal, so he changed him to Sentinel. He's still Sentinel, but that is a change on how some of the characters look and some of the technology that they have, some of the dynamic relationships. Some characters have passed on, some ones have come up, some villains have reformed, and some heroes have turned to the dark side. So it is going to be an awesome setting. Now, the system is BESM. So if someone said, oh, well, I don't need it, I have BESM, I can run superheroes with just BESM. Of course you can. Absolutely you can. But SAS is a great product that's going to be there, and it'll show you expressions of higher level. We don't deal with a lot of the 300 level characters in BESM, where if you have Superman, Sentinel, basically super high level, and there's some villains that are that high level as well, and so we have them. This is going to be good for people that want to run BESM and want to run high powered anime games. Well, SAS will give you some of those contexts again, so that's in there. So Absolute Power, as you all know the expression, absolute power, or power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's kind of one of the reflections of what's happening in Absolute Power, where things aren't quite as shiny and the heroes are constantly under pressure to grab just a little more power to take down the villains. And so Absolute Power was just a great name for what the world is. We're not going full on dark. This isn't this isn't like everyone is bad. This isn't The Boys. I mean, let me put it that way. This is not The Boys. But some of the aspects of that will come into play because some of the polish has been taken off some of these characters, and it's not always that easy to understand. I mean, when you look at Cruise Rider, some of the authoritarian regime that Cruise Rider was kind of looking at, you can kind of see that in some of the world powers now that are like supervillains or like regular governments. And what role does totalitarian regimes have when you're looking at, so how do I compete with this? And so it is a very interesting project, and Peter's been doing a bang up job. It's still underway, and so we have that. And then there are a couple of new products that we're going to be coming, new lines that we haven't talked about at all. I don't mind giving a little bit of a kind of a sneak peek a little bit about what we're doing with that. So make sure I'm just getting up the right images here to pass on. So one of the ones as we talked about was TriStat itself. And we're going to be coming out with a line of products which they're not BESM, and it's not Silver Age Sentinels, so it's not Absolute Power. It's not that. It is an expression of TriStat. And this is the more specific we get with something, because like BESM is multi-genre. It is everything, where we want to do something a little bit more explicit. So the first game that we're doing in the TriStat line is called Pixies. And this is a game where you're playing small little creatures, and you're living in houses, and there's cats and whatnot. And so this is a work in progress. This is not the final cover; it's in progress. But we're super happy with how it's turning out. And so this is a tri-stat game, and the core rulebook is 32 pages. There's some really great uses of tri-stat, and because we're being very, very specific on these characters, we don't need to cover nearly as much ground in terms of the whole power base. So that is one of the products that we're coming out with which is a box set of a line of box set games. Think of them kind of like your Dungeons and Dragons starter set. So your tri-stat games like this, Pixies is going to have a rule book, it's going to have characters, it's going to have adventure scenarios, it's going to have dice, and it's all going to be packaged in one box and probably going to run close to $25 for a complete game with all the fixings. And this is something that we want to do. There's other ones we have in the future. I'm not wanting to talk about them yet, but these are all very specific applications of the tri-stat system in a really interesting setting that kind of spins things a little bit differently. So that's one of them. And the second one, and we think this one has the potential to be so much better than what we did the first time. And this is Anime 5e. So this is the 2-page spread cover that you see. This is the new BESM D20, but this is not BESM D20. This is point-based anime Dungeons and Dragons. So it is Anime 5e, and it is specifically taking 5th edition and deconstructing it down and being true to Dungeons and Dragons, not what we did the first time when I did BESM D20. I took BESM and shoehorned it on top of D20 and said, I'm right. BESM is better. Use BESM in your D20 system. Well, not that time. This time what we're doing is saying, here's Dungeons and Dragons. Let's deconstruct it and turn it into a point-paced way and bring in the anime characters with character classes and levels and how to use the powers and how do we take the actual 5e system and use it in an anime expression. This and Saber, you have often mentioned it in the past couple of months. There's been so many times you've talked about this, and like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we're doing. And I know that that you'd be very interested in a product like this. The cover is just gorgeous. Love the spread. It is such a perfect version of what I consider anime Dungeons and Dragons, and that's what this is. It's supposed to. It is not BESM, which is why we're not calling it BESM. We're calling it Anime 5e. And that's really what it is. It's also, we called it BESM 5e, then we have BESM 4e. It's a little confusing. So this is Anime 5th edition. We think it's going to be great. The book is done, almost, like it's done. But one of the things we're going to be having as a pledge level is an insider pledges for people that want to get in and become playtesters on some of the stuff and get through and go over some of the stuff. And so it's a little more on the expensive end, of course, because you're getting all the products, plus you're becoming, quite an insider with some of this. And so these are just some of the sneak peeks of what we're going to be doing in the BESM Extras Kickstarters. And we have next year, we have the Anime 5e line, or mainly the core book, plus some accessories and that. We're doing the tri-stat box set line, which is starting with Pixies, and Silver Age Sentinels 2nd edition, which is now Absolute Power. That is some of the big stuff we had for next year, and hopefully one or two other licensed products maybe as well, if we can get that done. So lots of stuff going on. This is what I've been working on kind of nonstop during the shutdown. And while I haven't been talking a lot about what we've been doing, because I didn't want to take away the hype of BESM and waiting for the products, and I didn't want to make it look like vaporware by talking about all this stuff that when you don't even have the core books. Well, the core books are out. We've come through. We were really late with it, so I'm going to make up for the next one. But now I can start talking a little bit what our plans for next year, and it's going to be awesome. So I think I will kind of end the talk on that, the discussion. I went a little bit late, but I wanted to kind of give everyone a real feel to say, yeah, we got some good stuff working on. There's been a lot of work done. The Anime 5e is like 240 pages or so. One core book, which has monsters, it has all the rules you're going to need, all the classes, all the levels, it's all the items. It's pretty sweet. And then 32 pages, like on the opposite end, like really small for Pixies, which gives you everything you need in a really compact way of doing it. So so certainly November 10th, or following the socials on any of the stuff we do. We're at Descami, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. There's the BESM fan pages on Facebook. Of course, there's a Discord here, and these are all things that we're doing. And then leading up, it'll be a lot of promotion until November 10th. Then we do the Kickstarter, which will run for a little over 3 weeks. And if it does well, then we got some great things in store, and we're looking forward to having an awesome rest of 2020 and then next year as well. So at that point, I think I'll wrap everything up. Unless there's anything else that you need to go over with tech or anything.
No, that was everything we needed. So thank you
Good.
so much, Mark, for taking the time out of your day to do this. Thank you to everybody who is currently here. And I think we had a dozen people, maybe a little bit more max up. So very cool. Thanks for coming, everybody. Maybe we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, I think that would sound great. Maybe not this year, maybe with everything going on, but maybe 2021, do something early in the year. So thanks everyone for coming in and interacting and following along, and thanks for all your support and your understanding with the Kickstarter delays. And of course, thank you very much for hosting this. Really appreciate that and give me an opportunity to be out here and talk to everyone.
Alrighty, well, everyone have a wonderful evening, and we'll catch you all on the flip side.
All right, thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.